Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to my talk. Today I'll be presenting research that we've done using linked whole of population data to estimate education-related inequalities in cause-specific mortality in Australia. My name is Jenny Welsh. I'm a research fellow at the Australian National University, but I'm presenting this on behalf of a much bigger group of researchers. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this research has been funded by an NHMRC partnership grant led by Associate Professor Rosemary Corber. The background to this research is that socioeconomic inequalities in mortality are evident in virtually all high-income countries for which we have data, and the OECD recommends monitoring these inequalities with linked census mortality data and education as the measure of socioeconomic position. However, historically, these data have not been available for Australia, which has meant that we've relied on other methods to monitor inequalities here. And specifically, this has been a reliance on area-level measures of socioeconomic position. Now, these methods have served us incredibly well in the past, but they do have a number of limitations. The most important of which is probably that using area-level measures does not allow for international comparisons. However, the introduction of linked data through the Multi-Agency Data Integration Project, or the MADIP, now makes this possible. So the aim of this research was to quantify education-related inequalities in cause-specific mortality for Australia using census-linked to death data. So we used linked 2016 census. So we used census 2016 linked to death registrations data, which were available from 2016 through to 2017. And the data were all available through the MADIP. Our sample included Australian residents who were aged 25 to 84 years at the time of the census. Our exposure variable was education, as is recommended by the OECD. And for this paper, we had a focus on comparing those with low education with high education. The low education were those with no secondary school or any other qualifications, and those with high education were those with a tertiary or university level of education. Our outcome was cause-specific mortality, which we measured using the death registrations data, and cause was coded according to ICD-10 codes. And we had a focus on reporting inequalities for leading causes of death and causes according to preventability. Our analyses were really split up into two parts. So the first part, we ran a validation analysis of the linked census mortality data. And the second part of the analysis, we used negative binomial regression to estimate inequality in mortality. I'll talk a bit more about our methods a bit later on. So before I talk about, I go into the results, I want to talk a little bit about the linked data that we used. So as I said, we used Census 2016 linked to death registrations data through the MADIP. So underpinning the MADIP is a person linkage spine, which is used to create a person-level identification key by linking information from 3 separate administrative databases, which together result in virtually complete coverage of the resident population. The databases are Medicare Enrolment Database, which is a record of those who are covered by Medicare, which is Australia's universal health insurer, Social Security and Related Information Database, which contains records of those receiving government benefits, and Personal Income Tax Database, which is a record of all of those who lodge a tax return. So the spine really is what underpins the MADIP because it's the data source to which all other data sources are linked. So in this case, we had Census 2016 linked to the person linkage spine and death registration linked to the person linkage spine. So linkage was performed using deterministic and probabilistic linkage methods, using name, full date of birth, address, and sex. And it had linkage rates of 92% for the census and 97% for deaths. So the structure seems straightforward enough, but what sits behind it is actually a bit more complicated. So here I have a complicated figure reflecting that, and it's probably small for some of you, but I wanted to make the point that these things are not necessarily straightforward. So on this side, on the left-hand side, I have selection into the study from the full resident population of Australia on census night, down to our sample. And on this side, we have selection of deaths among all the residents in Australia down to our sample. So you can see, like any other data source, some people didn't complete the census. We have missed links as well as linkage error. And the same on the death side. So we have deaths that are potentially not captured in the data source. We have missed links. But having said that, in our sample, we had 87% of the population aged 25 to 84 years and 98% of deaths among the people in our sample linked to the spine, which meant that we had about 85% of deaths. So overall, 87% of the population and 85% of deaths. This is almost 19 million people in our final sample and almost 85,000 deaths. For the first part of this paper, we conducted a series of validation analyses with the aim of understanding the implications for bias, given that we were missing people from the census, that there were missed links and a small amount of linkage error. And to do this, so we compared mortality rates and inequalities in mortality using an area-based measure of socioeconomic position in the sample, so the analysis sample that we had, in the data set that we had, versus the estimates for the full population. So here are the first results. So what we found were that mortality rates in the sample were different to the rates in the population. So I have the results here for men, although the results for women were very similar. So we can see that, so here's the mortality rate in the population. This is from the ABS, so these are official numbers. And here's the mortality rate in our sample. So you can see that among the younger age groups, we underestimated deaths by up to 20%. We're pretty close in the older age groups, which is obviously where the vast majority of deaths occur. And if anything, we've slightly overestimated mortality rate in those age groups. So very similar patterns. These are for men, but very similar patterns for women. We also found that differences in mortality rates varied by cause of death. So some causes of death, we found that rates were very similar in the sample compared to the full population. That was for things like cardiovascular diseases and cancers, for example. In contrast, external causes of death like suicide and assault, we found were underestimated in our sample compared to the population, much more than this average. But knowing that the mortality rates are different or underestimated in our sample versus the population doesn't necessarily mean that we can't use the data to estimate unbiased estimates of relative measures of association. So the second component of this validation analysis compared estimates of socioeconomic inequalities using an area-based measure in the sample compared to the full population. So if these line up pretty well, we can be relatively confident that our relative measures of association produced in the analysis in our sample are pretty robust. So the results here were where we found no evidence of the association between socioeconomic position and death differed in the sample versus the population. Generally, things compared relatively well. The exception here was among young women. So here I have age standardized mortality rates by area level socioeconomic status, so the lowest compared to the highest. This is for women aged 25 to 44 years. And here are the different age groups here. Here are the estimates in the population, full population within an age group, and the sample. So you can see that among the two older age groups that we were working with, the estimates compared pretty well. They were pretty close. That was the case with all of the comparisons for men that we ran. The estimates compared really well. The exception here was among young women, where inequality estimates appear to be underestimated in the sample compared to the full population. So being reasonably confident that we could use these data to produce valid estimates, we then estimated education-related inequalities in cause-specific mortality for Australia. So we estimated sex and age group-specific rate ratios for each cause of death using negative binomial regression. We were able to correct for the differences in mortality rates in the sample versus the population. We did this by applying our internally estimated rate ratios to the population mortality rates to get our rate differences. Now, this method obviously assumes that the rate ratios are valid, and given the results of that second validation analysis, we were pretty confident in that, with the exception of young women. And given that we were unsure about the validity of results for young women, we chose not to report them. So here are the results. So here are the inequalities in leading causes of death, and I have the results here for men aged 25 to 44 years. And these estimates compare people with low versus high education. So here are the leading causes of death. So the leading cause was suicide, followed by accidental poisoning, land transport accidents, and so on. Diabetes and lymphoma and leukemia tied the 10th leading cause of death. This is the rate difference, low versus high education, the rate ratio, and I've plotted the rate ratio here. So a relative rate of 1 means that there's no evidence of any inequalities in that cause of death. So there's a couple of takeaway points here. So we have inequalities in most causes of death, although there is quite a bit of uncertainty in the estimates. So even with whole of population data, death in these young people is a relatively rare outcome. There are small numbers of events and quite a bit of uncertainty reflecting that. There are only 3 causes for which there's little evidence of inequalities in that cause of death: brain cancer, colorectal cancer, and lymphoma and leukemias. The largest absolute and relative inequalities are in external causes of death among young men. So that's suicide, accidental poisonings, land transport accidents, and assaults. Although you can also see large relative inequalities in ischemic heart disease and cirrhosis of the liver. So here are the same sort of results, but for women who are aged 45 to 64 years. More precision in the estimates here, and still we have inequalities in most causes of death, ovarian cancer being the only exception here, although we do have a slightly different pattern of results. Here, absolute and relative inequalities are largest for chronic diseases. Lung cancer, ischemic heart disease, and chronic lower respiratory diseases are particularly notable. I don't have time to present the results for men in this age group, or for men and women in the 65 to 84-year-old age group, but I will note that the results are pretty similar to these ones. So, such that inequalities were greatest for chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular diseases and smoking-related diseases. So in the final set of analyses, we looked at inequalities in mortality according to preventability. So for both men and women, and for all age groups, relative inequalities were largest for causes of death that were considered amenable to behaviour change. That was true. So absolute inequalities were also largest for causes of death amenable to behaviour change. The exception to this is among the younger men, where absolute inequalities were largest for causes of death amenable to injury prevention. So I've got the results here for men, but the pattern of results is very similar for women. So in conclusion, I think the MADEP is an exciting new development for linked data in Australia, and it can be used to estimate education-related inequalities in mortality. We found substantial inequalities in virtually all causes of death for each age and sex group. Inequalities were larger for preventable compared to non-preventable deaths overall. Inequalities were largest for injuries and external causes of death among young men, but among the older age groups, inequalities were largest for chronic diseases. And our findings highlight the ongoing opportunities to reduce inequalities in Australia and improve overall health of the population. I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to any questions or comments that any of you might have. I also note that the results of this paper are currently available as a preprint, so if you've got if you're interested, please follow the link. Thanks very much.